All right, it looks like our waiting room slowed down a little bit here, so we'll go ahead and get started. My name is Lauren, and I'm the Sustainability Coordinator for the City of Rochester. I assist Kevin in organizing the DMC's Sustainability Series. Welcome to our April series this month. We have a couple of speakers joining us to present on Olmsted County's Food Security Assessment. So our first speaker today is Matthew. He is a Program and Research Coordinator at the University of Minnesota's Institute on the Environment. Matthew's AmeriCorps service in East Tennessee brought them to the University of Minnesota, where they received a Master of Urban and Regional Planning with a focus on food systems and community-driven planning. While a graduate student, Matthew was the project lead and principal investigator for the Olmsted County Food Security Assessment and currently serves on the board of American Planning Association Food Systems Division. We also have Anna Oldenburg, who is a community health specialist with Olmsted County Public Health. Anna focuses on establishing relationships within the community by working with cross-sector partners to improve the environments in which we all live, work, play, and learn. Most of her work is done through the statewide Health Improvement Partnership, or SHIP grants, which implement strategies aimed at chronic disease prevention through policy, systems, and environmental changes. She's most proud of collaborative accomplishments she was fortunate to be a part of, including the passing of Tobacco 21 legislation in Olmsted County, the growth of the Village Agricultural Cooperative, a local organization providing land and opportunity to refugee and immigrant farmers, and the completion of this 2021 Olmsted Security Food Assessment. A little bit of background on the assessment before I hand it over to our presenters today. In 2019, multiple partners attended a food justice summit in Duluth, Minnesota, and afterwards gathered to talk about their learnings and discuss how we might take action here in Olmsted County. They decided to pursue a food security assessment in order to understand the current state of food security before jumping to any solutions here. Matthew was a graduate student from the U of M who was selected to lead the assessment and worked with Kelly Ray Kirkpatrick, our current council member, who served as his project advisor. Individuals from the University of Minnesota Extension, Channel 1, Rochester Public Library, the City of Rochester, and Olmsted County Public Health met regularly with Matthew and Kelly to complete the food security assessment over the course of 2020. Channel 1, Regional Food Bank, completed a co-design process, which listened to the voices of those experiencing food insecurity in 2021, and the food security assessment was completed later that fall. Matthew and the group presented findings of the assessment in a kickoff meeting held in September of last year, and attendees were asked to join the newly forming Olmsted County Food Security Coalition. So the report and the assessments will help guide the work of the coalition, and 2022 has been the first year of the coalition beginning to meet, establishing trust, and building those connections to further the mission of the group. With that, I'll hand it over to Matthew for our Grow, Eat, Learn, Share lessons from the 2021 Olmsted Food County Security Assessment.
Thank you so much, Lauren, and thank you everyone who came today, and Anna for helping me present on some of the findings and where we're going next. So yes, as Lauren mentioned, my name is Matthew Gabb, and yeah, I work at the Institute on the Environment at the University of Minnesota after having gotten my master's in urban planning up here in the Twin Cities. And yeah, and the best part of my time in grad school was definitely working on this assessment and working with the entire group of folks and getting to really know Olmsted County really well as we worked on this. So just the first thing I want to make sure to mention, of course, is that the work that we did to put together this assessment would not have been possible without the generous partnership and financial support of University of Minnesota Extension's Southeast Regional Sustainable Development Partnerships, who do a lot of incredible work, not just in Olmsted County, but across Southeast Minnesota to further projects such as this that help build the resilience of communities. So just a brief overview of what I'll be talking about for about the next half hour before I hand it over to Anna to talk about ways that everyone here can get involved in improving the food system here in Olmsted County. I'll be just doing a brief brief introduction to the assessment and some of the history and demographics that it walks through, as well as some of the data that we looked at and the statistics and mapping that we conducted, as well as our key takeaways, and then getting into kind of those call to actions, like what are the policies and kind of what are the implications of all of this really rich data that we compiled into this document, which at the end, there will be a link for if you really want to explore the whole assessment. If you want to get really weedsy and nerd out on the data, that's publicly available as well. And we'll have a link to that at the end. So Lauren went through some of this. So why a food security assessment? Again, these conversations were happening in the community starting in 2019. And obviously, well before that, food security is a huge topic in public health, in transportation and planning, in all sorts of sectors. But when COVID hit in 2020, it became a lot more urgent to get a better understanding of food security, food access, and the food system in our local communities. And that's because, in 2019, 7% of Olmsted County residents were classified as food insecure by the US Department of Agriculture. And that means that they had limited or uncertain availability of nutritionally adequate and safe foods, or they had a limited ability to acquire those foods in socially acceptable ways. And that second part is a key portion of what we were looking at in this assessment in some regards. Now, this number, it skyrocketed across the country. It wasn't as huge of a jump in Olmsted County as in other places in the US, but it's still a concerning jump, particularly if we drill down to children who had an even starker increase in food insecurity due to the onset of the COVID-19 pandemic in 2020. So before the pandemic, about 1 in 10 children in Olmsted County were food insecure. And we see in essentially virtually every county in the country, children are always the most food insecure overall population before looking at like race and gender and things, which we'll talk about in a moment. But that number went up to 14% in 2020. Now, both of these numbers have recovered some since then, but we're still not at those pre-COVID recovery numbers yet for food security. And the reason that these numbers are really concerning are not just because no one should go hungry, but because it reversed a trend where in 2019, food insecurity across the United States was at its lowest level since at least the 1990s, if not sooner. And so the question is, as we continue the social and economic and health recovery from the ongoing pandemic, how can we get back to this trend where food insecurity continues to decrease in our communities? Now, I've been talking a lot about kind of the broader numbers for the community writ large, but of course, as with many things, food insecurity is not felt equally. So looking at the 2019 numbers by race, this is known as the racial hunger gap, we see that about 8% of white individuals in the United States were food insecure in 2019. But you can see, on these charts here, how much wider that gap is for other racial groups. So 16% Latino individuals, nearly 20% of Black individuals, and almost a quarter, 24% of Native individuals in the United States are food insecure. And Feeding America doesn't have this data by race broken down by county, but we can assume that, even if we don't have the exact number, that white individuals in Olmsted County have a much lower level of food insecurity than BIPOC individuals across the county. And for those who might not be as familiar with the term, BIPOC, which you'll see in a few moments here, stands for Black, Indigenous, and People of Color. Now, kind of looking at All right, so those were the pre-COVID numbers in 2019. What has COVID done to the racial hunger gap? And it's hard to see, I'm sure, on your screens, but comparing Black and white individuals across the US, obviously for both groups, the food insecurity rates went up in 2020, as it did for everyone. And then in 2021, as the recovery sort of started, it's difficult to see on here, as I said, but white individuals are having a quicker recovery back to those pre-COVID rates than Black individuals are. And there was a lot of talk in 2020 and 2021 about COVID being the great equalizer, but we can see, at least in food insecurity rates, COVID is actually widening the disparities that already existed. We don't have the 2022 projections from Feeding America quite yet, but it feels safe to assume that, you know, it certainly has not narrowed to the pre-2019 gaps. And that's why in this assessment, we really made an effort to make sure to focus on the racial hunger gap, and on making sure that we have a lens of anti-racism and incorporating these lenses into the interventions in the food system. So that's just a very brief overview of why this is so important. So now it's, how did we get here? How did we potentially get to that 7% number in 2019 that then increased in various parts of the county to 9% during COVID? So I'm just going to briefly talk about two pieces of history, and there's a lot more, like I said, in the full assessment. And of course, I would be remiss to not mention that what is today Olmsted County is the traditional homelands of the Sisseton, Wahpeton bands, of the Santee, Dakota, of the Sioux peoples. And of course, you know, they have been stewarding these lands for hundreds of generations until white settlers arrived. And it's the state of Minnesota, as with every other state, there's been a very violent history with the Native nations and Indigenous peoples who have lived in our borders, which is part of why we see that huge disparity where 24% of Native individuals are food insecure in the US versus only versus 8% of white individuals in the United States. And so this is also like an important thing. This history is an important thing to keep in mind to make sure that we're targeting interventions that reduce those disparities and help heal some of the wounds from this historical violence. And another piece of history that we wanted to highlight was redlining, which was certainly not unique to Rochester and Olmsted County. For those who might not be as familiar, redlining was a part of the New Deal, where, as part of the economic recovery efforts coming out of the Great Depression, the federal government mapped over 200 cities across the country, including Rochester, Duluth, St. Paul, and assigned grades to residential neighborhoods that determined whether or not the federal government would back up mortgages that were given for folks to buy homes in those neighborhoods. And they were graded from, A, this is a great neighborhood, you would love to live there, we'll back up every mortgage, to D, which was deemed hazardous and would not get any mortgage backings or guarantees or loans from the federal government. And those ones that were rated D or colored in red on the maps, like you can see in this map of Rochester, were often deemed hazardous because they had African-American residents, immigrants, working class whites, all who were deemed to compromise, quote unquote, the values of homes and the security of mortgages. And I'll talk in a moment about how this history that we saw in Rochester, where we see those, those yellow and red neighborhoods on the map there, is still impacting food security and health disparities today. So kind of broadening our lens, looking forward, and not just kind of what's occurred previously in Olmsted County. Olmsted County is one of the state of Minnesota's most rapidly diversifying and growing counties, which is really exciting to see all the new folks and perspectives and new ways of cooking even, that are coming to Olmsted County. So in 2018, Olmsted County was about 80% white. By 2053, the Minnesota State Demographic Center predicts that it'll be about 64% white across Olmsted County. And the reason that's important to keep in mind is as we kind of prepare for this demographic shift is that we don't allow existing disparities to kind of exacerbate, essentially. So in 2018, 90% of the county's BIPOC residents lived in Rochester city limits. And you can kind of see on this map, these darker purple areas, that's where we see the highest amount of racial segregation in Olmsted County. I do want to note that Olmsted County is one of the counties in Minnesota that is one of the least segregated, and it's been on a desegregation trend, residential racial segregation. It's been desegregating faster than a lot of other counties in Minnesota, which is really great. And we want to ensure that that trend continues, which is why, again, we need to be keeping these things in mind as we develop policies and programs. So going back to redlining, and how do we still see that today? If we zoom into downtown Rochester, which of course, it's a much smaller area that was redlined than exists today because Rochester was much smaller in the 1930s. You can see I've overlaid on this map those kind of opaque white areas are the neighborhoods that were rated a C or a D. So those yellow and red-lined neighborhoods from the maps from the federal government. And we can see that those are still some of the most racially segregated parts of Rochester today. And I'll talk in a few minutes about some of the statistical measures that we did that show that redlining is actually a huge indicator of even how long you will live in Olmsted County, and why we need to be focusing interventions on neighborhoods that were historically redlined, if we want to reduce some of the racial disparities in Olmsted County. But it's not just racial segregation, of course. There's also things around class and income where we can key up any interventions in the food system to reduce class and income disparities. So Olmsted County, on average, across the board, has a higher income than the average Minnesotan does. And Minnesota, on average, again, is a wealthier state than most in the United States. But again, if we drill down, we can see that, of course, that affluence is not felt equally. And we can see some economic segregation, and applying the same statistics and indice numbers that we do for racial segregation in urban planning and stuff to economic segregation, we can see that actually it's not racial segregation that's as much of a problem in Olmsted County. It's actually far more economically segregated in Olmsted County. So you can see on this map where we can see kind of pockets where where higher levels of poverty are concentrated, particularly in northern and central Rochester, and some going into kind of the northwest and southeast. And that northwest-southeast corridor we'll be highlighting later in the presentation. But it's not just concentrated poverty, of course. Segregation is a two-way street. It's also concentrated affluence. So we can see, looking at median household income, how in Southwest Rochester and the areas outlying it, we see a concentration of some of the highest income households in the county, and how they have also kind of segregated themselves into certain neighborhoods as well. And of course, these are all policy decisions that we make, and policy decisions that we can intervene at, to make sure that we are a more racially and economically integrated county, which then, rising tide lifts all boats, helps to kind of make sure that all communities are properly invested in. So coming off of some of this demographic data, what are some of the stuff that we found in the assessment? So the first thing that we kind of realized was that when talking about food security, we often think about food deserts. And that is a very specific definition and measure from the USDA that defines, like, in a census tract, which you kind of saw those on the earlier maps, it's the smallest geographic area the Census Bureau provides data for. And so it's the one that we use because it's the most granular that we can get to really understand where things are happening. It's essentially a measure of, like, how many grocery stores are in a tract and what is the, like, poverty level of the tract, and that's it. But all of us, I'm assuming, have eaten in our lives and have, potentially gone to grocery stores and things. And we know that that's not the only thing that impacts whether or not it's easy for us to get food. Is the grocery store on the way home from work? Is there a sidewalk? Can I afford it? Like, things like that. And so we decided that food deserts are an important measure and we would include it. But to get a bigger, broader picture of food insecurity in Olmsted County, we needed to kind of create our own measure and our own index to understand, as we move forward, when Anna talks about the Food Security Coalition, where with potentially limited resources, interventions can be best targeted to make the most impact and get the most bang for our buck. So how did we do this? There is no one piece of data that will say this is food insecurity for this neighborhood. That doesn't exist, and I wouldn't want to use it anyway if that had existed for this assessment, because again, I think it would have been incomplete. So what we instead decided to do was kind of use a proxy. So we decided to look at how long, and this is obviously these are pre-COVID numbers and will likely change once the Census Bureau has a better grasp on COVID's impact. So we decided to look at when someone is born in a certain neighborhood in Olmsted County, how long are they expected to live? And Olmsted County has one of the highest life expectancies in the state of Minnesota. However, and it's probably a little hard to see on this map, this central tract here right on downtown Rochester, someone born in that tract, and I know that there are other influences such as like Mayo Clinic and things that influence some of these numbers in addition to what we looked at. But someone in that tract, born in that tract, is estimated to die by the age of 66. Whereas just a few miles up the road in this purple tract outlined in white, someone born there will probably is expected on average to live to almost 90. So it's a 24-year disparity in how long people in Olmsted County are expected to live. So obviously we were aghast at that disparity and want to make sure that any interventions we make are working to reduce this disparity and make sure that we get to the point where everyone in Olmsted County, no matter where they're born, has the opportunity to live to nearly 90 years old. We felt that was really important to center as we developed this index and these measures. So what we did is I went through the academic literature and studies on food insecurity, because again, there is no one number, and looked at what are the things that we already know create the food insecurity rates that we see. And looking at those, comparing them to data we are able to publicly access, we then created an index where I conducted some statistical regressions looking at, for all 33 census tracts in Olmsted County, we incorporated the percentage of households who don't have a car, the number of food stores, the percentage of households using SNAP benefits, the percentage of residents without health insurance, the percentage of renters who are cost burdened, meaning more than 30% of their income per month is spent on rent and housing, and therefore reducing the amount they can spend on food. If it was redlined by the federal government, and that one actually was a huge indicator of lower life expectancy. The percentage of BIPOC residents, because that is a proxy for disinvestment and a lack of social services due to structural racism. The median household income, and the poverty rate. And of course, can never be an all-inclusive picture of that disparity in life expectancy, But those 9 indicators that we know impact food insecurity explain 53% of the variation in life expectancy across the country, which from a statistical background is just like a wildly high number and probability rate to get from just 9 indicators. So it means that intervening along these 9 indicators can have an outsized impact, I should say, on reducing those disparities in life expectancy, while also being something that will reduce food insecurity. So we layered all 9 of those in some GIS mapping software to then see which parts of the county have high rates of all 9 and which might only have a couple. So we can see again that, as I mentioned, that kind of northwest to southeast corridor that we see here, as well then down in Stewartville, where we see kind of the highest opportunity and potential where an intervention will have an outsized impact in reducing food insecurity and in increasing life expectancy for the folks who are born and live in these tracts. And these maps are available in the assessment for folks to delve into a little deeper. And I have, as an appendix, you can get a detailed breakdown for every single tract. What was its score? What were all the percentages and numbers for each of those 9 indicators? And I encourage you to dig into those and maybe start to think creatively about what then the interventions can be in each of these parts of the county. So I just talked a lot of data at y'all and threw a lot of numbers out and a lot of maps. So what are some of the bigger picture takeaways that we learned from the assessment that we can take moving forward that aren't just dehumanized numbers? So the first is particularly thinking about COVID, that food insecurity, it's a public health issue and it should be treated with a public health lens, because public health and using those public health lenses give us more holistic solutions, and they show us the intersections that food insecurity has with income, childcare, land use, transportation, economic justice, racial justice, disability justice, all of these things. And that, like other cities such as I've outlined it in the assessment, such as Baltimore and Emporia, Kansas, and Elgin, Illinois, that have used a public health lens specifically for their transportation, zoning, budget, and other policy decisions. And also, I didn't talk about it much in the presentation just for time's sake, but local farmers, we have a section on them that I knew going in, because there just isn't much data on agriculture available, what is an inadequate section and discussion, and they need to be at the table and part of any groups and policy making going forward. And as I talked about some with food deserts, the traditional interventions are just not cutting it anymore, particularly with the COVID recovery and climate change. Studies have shown that just putting a grocery store in a food desert, it doesn't work. It usually closes within a year or two because it hasn't gone at the root issue, which is people can't get to the grocery store. They don't have sidewalks. They don't have enough money because they're paying too much in rent. It's all of these things that aren't considered when, the town that I grew up in, Maryland, just gave a grocery store some tax breaks, but then it closed within 2 years when it opened in a food desert. And also there's a gap in that food insecure people who might be $1,000 over income limits for things like SNAP and WIC and some food pantries are then not being served by our traditional programs and interventions. And any new interventions need to ensure that they don't continue to fall through the cracks. And finally, I've mentioned this a few times, making sure that as Olmsted County continues to grow and diversify, that our policies and interventions don't just exacerbate existing inequities and disparities, but actively work to eliminate them from the outset. And so that requires being proactive and hands-on, centering the racial hunger gap, and really focusing on reducing racial and economic disparities, both in general, but also within food security measures. So I just want to take a couple minutes because a lot of that is very down in the dumps and is like, okay, this all sucks. What do we do from here? And I want to highlight first a couple of the really cool things that we've seen happening in Olmsted County, and then some of the really cool things that we've seen happening in other communities that could potentially be modeled here. So the first, one that was mentioned that Anna had a huge hand in is, of course, the Village Agricultural Cooperative, which has, as of last year, 5 acres across 5 sites, growing from just a few community gardens, and a huge, incredible focus on new immigrants and first-generation growers. And it's programs like these that are, again, getting ahead and being proactive about the demographic shift in Olmsted County and making sure that no one gets left behind as we get new residents and new Americans who are coming to Minnesota. The next one I want to highlight, one that's near and dear to my heart, because I wish we had something like this up in Minneapolis that was more robust like it is down in Olmsted County, is the Rochester Public Library Seed Library, which is now about to start, or has started, its 4th year in a row for RPL patrons to check out packets of seeds. And when we put together the assessment, we didn't have all the 2021 data yet. But in 2020, patrons checked out over 12,000 packets of seeds to grow at home, 4,000 of which were donated by community members, which there's a lot of seed science that is beyond my pay grade that's been done, but like having those locally grown and donated seeds is actually really important for seed and plant resilience and increasing the resiliency of a local food system, because that those are seeds that can grow in Southeast Minnesota's climate, which is going to be very different than if you buy a seed from the internet but was grown down in Tennessee, which has a very different growing season and climate, and plants need different adaptations for it. And then over in Byron, at Byron High School in 2019, we saw B-Town Bistro, which was started by students in the culinary and business classes. And it's a food truck where they do the cooking, they do all the operating, the networking, the advertising, everything. So it's not only teaching the students entrepreneurial and cooking and culinary skills, and then for the Future Farmers of America students that grow the produce for the truck, learning additional growing skills and how to grow to scale for something like a food truck. But it also it's another way to have a mobile access point of food for the community. And all of those things playing together, it's just a really incredible community asset that I hope moving forward more high schools across Olmsted County and Minnesota can emulate programs such as what's happening over at Byron High. So the rest of the assessment dives into 34 strategies from peer communities across the country. We do a deep dive on Ann Arbor, Boulder, Iowa City, and Madison, because they were also the comparison cities for a draft of Rochester's 2040 comprehensive plan. So we wanted to maintain that consistency and also recognize that we see those cities and communities as our peers. So what are they doing that we know works there that then almost certainly we know can work here? And then we pulled from other communities across the country. And I've got a little bit over time, so I'm just going to give 2 words about each one and encourage you to really go into the assessment and read them in detail. So the first from Madison is Boulevard gardening. So that strip of grass between the road and the sidewalk that I never get the same answer from anyone as to what it's called. Making sure giving additional growing space for folks to have for home gardening. I live in Minneapolis. I'm about to build a raised bed in my boulevard. I'm very excited. It's going to make everyone's walks very beautiful and give me another place to grow some carrots. And then in addition, allowing for natural lawns, which not only, again, looks really nice if you're walking around the neighborhood, but is crucial for pollinators such as our endangered state bee, the rusty patch bumblebee. It reduces mowing, which if you don't mow, you're not putting as many greenhouse gases into the air, and it reduces watering, which, fingers crossed we don't have another drought year like we did last year, but if we can, anything we can to reduce residential water usage is a good and positive intervention that will have ripple effects. And then briefly, just it's all, you know, it's good to have people to grow things, but again, like we saw in Byron, making sure that we're training youth to have positive interactions with the food system as well, such as Urban Roots up in St. Paul, and they are paid high school internships, and the paid part I think is really crucial to making sure that students feel valued. As well as then going beyond just having an assessment like we did, but you know, some of the work of the coalition is, you know, making actual plans and outlining the suite of policies and interventions that will be done, such as has been done in East Point, Georgia, with the Atlanta region's first ever city food system and agriculture plan. So yeah, I'm just going to breeze through these because I want to make sure that there's plenty of time for Anna to talk about what we're doing at the coalition. And if we have time, I can go back into some of those later. But I think it's really important to talk about the next steps and how we can implement policies and changes in the food system.
Thank you, Matthew. Before I hand it over to Anna, we did have one question in the chat, and maybe this is something Anna can cover. And I'm thinking it might be something Channel 1 looked at with the co-design sessions that they hosted. But the question is, are any of these solutions also taking the effort and time it takes for food insecure people to grow their own food?
Yeah, that's an excellent question. And I think that's a huge part of the solution as well, is making sure that everyone who wants to grow their own food, everyone who wants to grow their own cultural food has the ability to do so. And that's a huge part of what the Village Agricultural Cooperative is working towards, is making that a reality. And I think continuing to center solutions around food insecurity to that point as well is how do we make sure everybody has that ability to do so. So some of the policy suggestions that have been put forth in other communities is making sure that when we are looking at building new housing, is there green space or rooftop access for residents to grow food at different housing locations, things like that. So great question and great point, and something that is very much integrated into this as well. So yes, I just want to reiterate just the gratitude for Matthew for this presentation, for their assistance with this food security assessment. It's been a while since I've seen them present this, and I'm just like blown away again at the quality of this work. So even though I've been or was a part of this for so long through 2020 and 2021, it's just, again, so important, and I'm so glad that we're talking about this, and special thanks to Lauren and Kevin for allowing us to present to all of you. So I just want to speak quickly about the Olmsted County Food Security Coalition. One of the main recommendations that came out of the assessment was that Olmsted County needs a food security coalition. We historically have not had a space where community members, nonprofits, organizations can come together and talk about food insecurity and how can we work together to solve these issues collectively in the past. And so we see that communities that have these types of coalitions are much more successful at reducing their food insecurity rates. And so that was our goal. So as was mentioned in the introduction, this assessment, we had a kickoff meeting in September of 2021, where we invited folks at that kickoff meeting to come join the coalition. We actually had our first coalition meeting in December of 2021. It took us a little time between September and December, as we were really wanting to get it right. And we hired a facilitator, Mia Ulysses, who is the founder of an organization in the Twin Cities area called Rooted Solutions. So she has extensive background and experience with organizing food security coalitions. So we were able to hire her as a facilitator, and we had been meeting monthly from December until currently. So we've met January, February, March, and are scheduled to meet next week. And really why we thought it was so important to have a facilitator guide that discussion is to truly set a foundation of trust, of respect, of joint understanding of both the food insecurity assessment as well as Channel 1's co-design process, to really use these two foundational documents and studies to guide the work that this coalition will eventually do. So some key accomplishments that we've gone through so far. We've met and have agreed on a decision-making model as well as group agreements. And currently we're working through how to develop a stipend structure so that individuals who are not being paid to attend the meetings through their job or a different position or where essentially paying community members for their valuable time and experience to attend these meetings. So we're working through that currently and hope to have a decision made there soon, as well as we are delighted for her, but sad for us. Mia, our facilitator, is going on to pursue her MBA and no longer has the capacity to do some of this extra facilitation for us. So we are currently looking to put out an RFP for a facilitator and hopefully somebody locally to help continue the facilitation of this coalition work. So that's kind of where we're at right now. And would definitely love if you've had interest in this presentation for you to join us, come alongside us if you want to attend a meeting just to listen in and kind of see what it's all about. Please let me know. My contact information was in the slide, and I know Lauren and Kevin can provide that as well if you'd like to attend those meetings going forward.
Thank you again, Anna and Matthew, for that presentation. At this point, we'll just open it up. If there are any questions from anyone joining us today, you can feel free to unmute yourself and ask them, or if you're more comfortable putting it in the chat, we can read them from there as well.
There has been some questions in the chat around presence of rooftop gardens that are growing food. So I don't know if Anna or Matthew, if you're familiar of local case studies or examples of that, or maybe a case study that we can look to for, I don't know, to be motivated.
Yeah, no, it's a great question. Yeah, and I saw Angela's comment in the chat that there is a small green roof at the Heinz Center, which is great. Like, I love a green roof. Yeah, I don't know of any like rooftop gardens in Olmsted County off the top of my head. I also don't remember in my perusal of the ordinances any city prohibiting them. So, you know, that's always an option. I'm trying to think of a case study off the top of my head, and I don't have one, but I've got some in a document somewhere that I can peruse while we're asking some other questions, and I can drop it in the chat for folks to explore and get some ideas from.
I think, you know, Matthew, you mentioned it too with the Boulevard gardening. I think whether it's rooftop, whether it's Boulevard, whether it's raised bed at apartment buildings or housing complexes, it just where can people grow food where it's easily accessible, where they don't have to travel to grow the food that they want to consume. So thinking about the ease and accessibility and where can we put that in, and making sure we don't have any policies that prohibit something like that. I'm seeing in the chat a question that I could answer. What is the immediate next step for Olmsted County to start working on these action items? I think the immediate next step is our food security coalition. So I mentioned that this group right now is really very new, and the main goal currently is to build that foundation of trust and relationship building and make sure that this group is inclusive of the decisions of the community, so that we're making these decisions together in an inclusive way. So expanding our membership, making sure it's equitable, as I mentioned, with the stipends to attend. And then as we get this group, this foundation set for this group, the goal is that we would have this group then work on some of these action items, some of these decision-making points. And I think there's a number of ways that that can look, and that's kind of where we're headed right now is, can we get this group to work together on some of these action items or bring forth some proposals or items such as that to make improvements in the food insecurity status in our county.
Just to add to that too, Anna participated in our sustainability and resiliency task force, and the city put together a sustainability and resiliency plan last year that does have several strategies that tie into this work. One specifically that is to continue to support the outcomes from this food security assessment, and some other strategies that specifically focus on education opportunities and how we're just reusing places in our community that are vacant or underused to support initiatives like this. So local food was well represented in those strategies as well, and something we're looking at as a city in partnership with community partners, how we can continue to implement various strategies related to local food efforts. There's a question in the chat. There's an organization, oh, and it was answered. Thank you, Kevin.
They've also done a past sustainability series too. If folks are, we have at the recording of that, so I'll share it after this meeting, a list of all of them. But if folks want to tune into that one.
Any other questions for our presenters today? If not, thank you all for joining us. If you do have questions, we will be following up with the materials from today's presentation, as well as contact information, and we're happy to connect with anyone afterwards if they'd like to discuss this further or have any ideas. Thank you for joining our April Sustainability Series.
Thank you very much.